Imagine walking into a home furnished with items made of human remains. Yeah, that owner is Ed Gein. Once again, it's Murder and Mayhem Monday. Welcome back. Or if you're new to the channel, thanks for tuning in. My name is Franklin James, the serial author, and today we're going to be diving into the sick and sinister mind of Ed Gein, the so-called Butcher of Plainfield. And I'm pretty excited to talk about Ed Gein because next month, during the spooky season, Netflix has a biographical crime drama coming out about him. It's called Monster, the Ed Gein story, and he's going to be played by Charlie Hunnam, famous for his role as Jax Teller from the show Sons of Anarchy. And it looks like Netflix did a really great job casting him for this role, so I'm really looking forward to this show, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about the Butcher of Plainfield on this episode. Because when it comes to Ed Gein, there was murder and mayhem, and his crime shocked the nation in the 1950s. I mean, he inspired countless horror characters from Norman Bates in Psycho, a novel written by Robert Bloch, to Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yet beyond the sensationalism, there are some deeper, unsettling questions. For instance, what shaped the fractured mind of Ed Gein and what drove him down the path he chose? I feel like to better understand Ed Gein, we must begin with his childhood, right? To gain some insight into his upbringing. Now, he was born in 1906 in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and he was raised in an environment of isolation and control. His father, George, who was an alcoholic, he couldn't keep a job, and his mother, Augusta, she was a domineering, fanatically religious woman. In fact, she believed that all women, aside from herself, were instruments of sin. So she made Ed and his brother Henry believe that sex and desire were evil. From her point of view, the world was corrupt, and salvation only came through her teachings. Psychologists would later look back at his home environment and identify it as a breeding ground for pathology. Ed Gein grew up cut off from normal social relationships, and he was deeply dependent on his mother. So he was unable to form a healthy sense of self outside of her control, which is crucial for a child's development. Which tells me that his mother likely grew up in a strict environment devoid of love, feeling worthless and inadequate. And she projected that onto her children. And they were filling that void in her life. Making them reliant on her meant that their love for her would never go away. However, when Henry began questioning their mother's beliefs, he soon died under suspicious circumstances in a marsh fire. Some speculate that Ed may have been responsible for his death, but it was never proven. What matters psychologically is what came next. Augusta became Ed's entire world. In fact, according to Ed, her death in 1945 was devastating. He described it as losing his only friend, his only true love. This is what psychologists refer to as an Oedipal fixation, which is an unhealthy, arrested attachment to one's own mother. When Ed's mother died, he didn't just lose a parent, he lost the anchor of his entire identity. And as a result, he withdrew further into isolation, which is to be expected. He boarded up most of the farmhouse, but kept his mother's room pristine, even while he was living in squalor in a tiny portion of the house. Now, psychologically, this retreat reflects a regression, a return to childlike coping mechanisms. And during this time, Ed filled that void in his life with macabre fantasies. He read pulp magazines about Nazis, cannibals, and headhunters. He also turned to grave robbing, exhuming the bodies of women who reminded him of his mother. And from a psychological lens, this was Ed's attempt at reuniting with his mother in a distorted, literal way. The corpses became substitutes for the mother he could never have again. However, in 1957, we were able to gain even more insight into his psychotic break, which centered around a hardware store owner. Her name was Bernice Warden, and she disappeared around 9:30 on the morning of November 16th. Now, her son Frank reported her missing when he stopped by the store Later that day, he saw that the cash register was open and bloodstains were on the floor. He also told authorities that Ed Gein might be a suspect because he was in the hardware store the evening before, and he was set to return that very morning. And because Ed Gein had the last receipt written by Bernice Warden, he was taken into custody. And the police, they searched his farm. And in a shed, a sheriff's deputy discovered Warden's decapitated body hung upside down by her legs. Her torso was dressed out like a deer. She had been shot with a 22 cal rifle, and her body was mutilated post mortem. And once authorities entered his home, what they found was beyond comprehension. There were human skin masks, bowls made of skulls, chairs and lamps upholstered with flesh, waste baskets and belts made of skin, skulls on his head posts, and a woman's suit he had been stitching together from corpses. I mean, to the outside world, it was monstrous, and I can certainly see why. But psychologically, these artifacts represented Ed's attempt to become his mother, or at the very least embody the feminine form she had denied him. Psychiatrists later diagnosed Ed with schizophrenia and a severe personality disorder. But some experts argue he wasn't psychotic in a typical sense because he knew grave robbing was wrong and he tried to conceal his actions. Instead, his crimes were ritualistic, symbolic, and rooted in pathological grief and identity confusion. However, Ed Gein was declared legally insane and spent the rest of his life in psychiatric institutions until his death in 1984. But his case continues to fascinate psychologists because it sits at the intersection of trauma, repression, and fantasy. Ed Gein wasn't a serial killer in the usual sense, right? He wasn't motivated primarily by lust or power, but rather a broken, obsessive attachment to his mother. His story isn't just about murder or furniture made of human skin. It's about what happens when the human mind twists under unbearable psychological pressure. When we look at Ed Gein, we don't just see Leatherface, Buffalo Bill, or even Norman Bates. He was a man who experienced abuse, isolation, and a lot of unresolved grief. But I do want to thank you all for tuning in. And I do ask that you stab that like button and subscribe. Leave a comment and let me know what you think about the Butcher of Plainfield. Share this video out there, crack that bell for notifications, and if possible, avoid mayhem.